Zethkar stood in front of the great silver screen in the council chambers and felt his 3 hearts beating faster than normal. The Council of Galactic Monitoring had just given him what they called a simple job, but he knew nothing was ever simple when it came to watching new species fight their first real war. His long blue fingers tapped against the data pad as he read the mission details for the 3rd time. The humans had joined the galactic community only 2 cycles ago, and most of the older species still thought of them as children playing with toys they did not understand. They had big ships and loud weapons, but everyone said they would learn quickly that space war was different from whatever they did on their small blue planet. The Corvan Empire had decided to test these humans and had taken over a planet called Kepler 442b that the humans claimed was theirs. Zethkar had watched many species fight their first space battles, and it always ended the same way. The new species would charge in with wild energy and no real plan, get beaten badly by whoever they were fighting, then spend the next few hundred years learning how real war worked before trying again. The Corvans were perfect teachers for this lesson because they never killed more than they had to, and usually let the losing side keep some of their ships and dignity. His ship, the Observer's Eye, was already loaded with the best recording equipment the Council had, and a small crew of experts who specialized in watching battles and writing reports. Zethkar had done this job for over 40 years and had seen Trilaxians fight Bendari, watched the Aquatic Federation try to take on the Stone Empire, and documented at least 12 other First Wars. He was very good at predicting how long a fight would last and how badly the new species would lose. The council leader, an ancient being whose species had stopped fighting wars before Zethkar was born, handed him the final orders and reminded him that this was just routine work. The humans had maybe 50 ships and the Corvans had brought 300. The planet was mostly empty except for some human research stations and Corvan military bases. It should be over in a few days, and then Zethkar could write another report about how a new species learned that space was dangerous and fighting required more than enthusiasm. But something felt different about this assignment, and Zethkar could not figure out what it was. He had read all the files about humans and they seemed normal enough. They came from a planet with lots of water and different kinds of weather. They fought each other for thousands of years before reaching space, and they liked to explore new places. Their technology was basic but functional, and their ships were built more for traveling than fighting. Everything suggested they would lose quickly and learn important lessons about how the galaxy really worked. The Observer's Eye left the Council Station 3 days later, and Zethkar spent the journey reading more about both species. The Corvans were exactly what he expected, a military empire that had conquered many worlds through superior technology and perfect coordination. Their soldiers were enhanced with mechanical parts that made them stronger and faster, and they all shared thoughts through neural links that let them work together like parts of the same machine. They followed ancient battle plans that had worked for centuries, and rarely lost fights against species with similar technology levels. The humans were harder to understand because their files contained many contradictions. They had spent most of their history fighting each other in wars that seemed to have no logical purpose, using weapons and tactics that changed constantly. Some reports said they were peaceful and curious. Others described them as aggressive and unpredictable. Their military records showed they had developed hundreds of different ways to fight on their planet, but no one was sure if any of those methods would work in space. When the Observer's Eye reached the Kepler system, Zethkar activated the stealth systems and positioned his ship where it could watch the entire planet without being detected. The Corvan fleet was already there, arranged in perfect defensive formations around their bases on the surface. Their ships were sleek and efficient, built for quick strikes and overwhelming firepower. Everything was exactly as Zethkar had expected, and he began setting up his recording equipment. The human fleet arrived exactly when their messages had said they would, and Zethkar got his first real look at their ships. They were larger than he had expected, but moved in loose groups that seemed almost random compared to Corvan precision. The humans sent the usual challenges and demands that all species made before fighting, and the Corvans responded with their standard warnings and ultimatums. Both sides positioned their fleets and began the careful dance that always happened before space battles started. Zethkar prepared his notes and started the recorders, expecting to document another quick defeat. followed by negotiations and surrender. The Corvins had more ships, better technology, and thousands of years of experience. The humans had enthusiasm and some clever ideas, but that would not be enough against professional soldiers who had perfected the art of space warfare. He settled into his observation chair and watched the displays showing both fleets moving into attack positions. In a few hours, this would all be over, and he would begin writing his report about how the humans had learned their first important lesson about the realities of galactic conflict. It was routine work, but someone had to document these moments for future species who would face similar challenges. The first human ships began moving toward the planet, and Zethkar increased the recording resolution to capture every detail of what would certainly be a quick and educational defeat. The human attack began before dawn on the planet's surface, and Zethkar immediately knew something was wrong with what he was seeing. Instead of the massive fleet battle he had expected, only a few human ships approached the Corvin positions while the rest stayed far away from the fighting. Those few ships launched small pods toward the planet's surface, each one carrying what appeared to be tiny groups of human soldiers. Zethkar adjusted his instruments to follow the pods as they fell through the atmosphere like burning stars. The Corvins were firing at them with surface weapons, but the pods were too small and fast to hit easily. Most of them landed safely in areas far from the main Corvin bases, which made no sense to Zethkar because standard galactic warfare required attacking the enemy strongholds directly to achieve quick victory. He focused his cameras on one group of humans led by someone his computer identified as Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez. She and her team of 12 soldiers climbed out of their crashed pod and immediately began moving through the forest that covered much of the planet. Zethkar expected them to head toward the nearest Corvin base and begin the kind of direct assault that all species used in their first space war. Instead, the humans spread out into the trees and disappeared. Zethkar spent several minutes searching for them with his best detection equipment before finally locating their heat signatures moving slowly through the dense vegetation. They were not heading toward any Corvin position, but seemed to be following animal paths and natural cover that would keep them hidden from enemy sensors. The Corvin commander, whose name appeared on intercepted communications as General Kexmore, sent patrol groups to find and eliminate the human landing parties. His soldiers moved in perfect formation using their enhanced senses and shared consciousness to search every area where the pods had landed. Zethkar recorded their efficient methods and professional coordination, expecting them to quickly locate and destroy the scattered human teams. The first Corvin patrol that went missing consisted of 8 enhanced soldiers who had been searching a valley about 20 kilometers from their main base. Their neural links simply stopped transmitting during what should have been a routine sweep of empty forest. General Kexmore sent another patrol to find the first one, and they discovered the area where the missing soldiers had last reported their position. Zethkar enhanced his recordings of that location and felt something cold move through his body when he saw what the second Corvin patrol had found. The 8 missing soldiers were arranged in a neat line along a fallen tree, each one killed by weapons that Zethkar did not recognize. The wounds looked like they had been made by small metal projectiles rather than the energy weapons that all civilized species used in modern warfare. But what disturbed Zethkar more than the primitive weapons was the way the bodies had been positioned. Someone had taken time to arrange them carefully, almost like they were sending a message to whoever found them. The Corvins were known throughout the galaxy for their mechanical efficiency and logical thinking, but Zethkar could hear confusion and something that might have been fear in their communications as they reported the discovery. General Kexmore increased patrols and ordered his soldiers to stay in larger groups with constant communication links. He sent detailed reports to his superiors describing the unusual human tactics and requesting additional troops to deal with what he called an unconventional enemy approach. Zethkar had read thousands of similar reports from other First Wars, and they all sounded the same. But something in the Corvin general's voice suggested this situation was different. More patrols went missing over the next few days, and each discovery was stranger than the last. Sometimes the Corvin soldiers were found with their equipment missing, and their bodies marked with symbols that meant nothing to galactic databases. Other times they were discovered in places that seemed impossible to reach without flying vehicles, arranged in patterns that served no obvious military purpose. Zethkar began focusing his instruments on Amy Rodriguez and her team to understand what the humans were actually doing. He watched them move through the forest like they had been born there, using skills that seemed more appropriate for hunting animals than fighting a modern war. They set traps using primitive materials, tracked corvan movements by reading signs in the dirt, and communicated with each other using gestures and sounds that his equipment could barely detect. When Rodriguez's team finally encountered a corvan patrol, Zethkar recorded the entire engagement, expecting to see how human weapons compared to advanced corvan equipment. What he saw instead made him question everything he thought he knew about how civilized species conducted warfare. The humans did not announce themselves or demand surrender according to galactic protocols. They simply attacked from hiding using methods that seemed designed more to terrify than to kill efficiently. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes, but Zethkar found himself watching the recording over and over, trying to understand what had happened. The humans had used the forest itself as a weapon, turning every tree and rock into part of their attack. They moved like predators rather than soldiers, striking from unexpected directions and disappearing before the corvans could respond effectively. When it was over, 3 corvan soldiers were dead and the rest were so badly shaken that they could barely report what had happened. Rodriguez and her team vanished back into the forest, leaving behind another carefully arranged scene that would confuse and frighten the next patrol that found it. General Kexmore's communications became increasingly urgent as he tried to explain to his superiors that the humans were not fighting according to any recognizable strategy. His reports described an enemy that seemed more interested in psychological warfare than territorial conquest, using tactics that violated several galactic conventions about proper military conduct. Zethkar had never heard a corvan commander sound uncertain before, and the change in tone made him deeply uncomfortable. By the end of the first week, Zethkar realized he was not documenting a normal first war between species learning to fight in space. He was watching something much stranger and more disturbing, something that suggested the humans had brought their own ideas about warfare into the galaxy, without bothering to learn how civilized species were supposed to behave. The storm that hit Kepler 442b during the second week of fighting was the kind of weather event that usually stopped all military operations until it passed. Zethkar watched from his safe position in space as lightning filled the sky and rain turned the planet's surface into a maze of flooding rivers and muddy ground. The corvans pulled their patrols back to their fortified bases and waited for conditions to improve, following standard military procedure that had worked for their species for thousands of years. The humans saw the storm as an opportunity, and Zethkar tracked several teams moving through the chaos toward corvan positions. One group led by Sergeant Danny Clark carried equipment that his sensors identified as primitive explosive devices, the kind of crude weapons that civilized species had stopped using centuries ago. Zethkar expected the storm to stop them like it had stopped everyone else, but instead they seemed to move faster and more confidently in the terrible weather. Danny Clark and his team reached the main corvan base during the worst part of the storm, when lightning was striking the ground every few seconds, and the rain was so heavy that even enhanced corvan sensors could not see more than a few meters. Zethkar watched in fascination as the humans used the storm itself to mask their approach, timing their movements with thunder crashes and using flooded areas to avoid detection systems. The corvan base was supposed to be impregnable, built with the best defensive technology the Empire had developed over centuries of warfare. Energy shields protected it from orbital bombardment. Automated weapons covered every approach, and the base itself was buried deep enough underground to survive almost any attack. General Kexmore had positioned his command center there because it represented everything advanced about corvan military engineering. But Zethkar realized the humans were not trying to break through those defenses in any way the corvans had planned for. Instead of attacking the shields or weapons directly, Danny Clark's team was studying how the base worked and looking for weaknesses that existed not in the design, but in the assumptions behind it. They spent hours in the storm observing how power flowed through the facility and where the critical systems were located. When they finally acted, it was not with the kind of massive assault that galactic warfare manuals described. Instead, they placed their primitive explosives in locations that Zethkar's advanced scanners identified as structurally insignificant. The humans seemed to be attacking parts of the base that had nothing to do with its defensive capabilities, focusing on support systems and backup equipment that would normally be ignored during proper military operations. The first explosion happened exactly as a lightning strike hit the base's main power relay, and Zethkar initially thought it was just a coincidence. The second explosion came during another thunder crash and took out what appeared to be a minor ventilation system. By the time the third explosion destroyed a water processing plant, Zethkar understood that the humans were not trying to destroy the base directly, but were instead turning its own systems against it. Each small explosion caused cascading failures throughout the facility as automated systems tried to compensate for damage in ways their programmers had never anticipated. The humans had somehow learned to read Corvan technology well enough to predict how it would respond to specific types of failure, and they were using that knowledge to create a chain reaction that would destroy the base from within. General Kexmore's communications became frantic as his perfect fortress began collapsing around him, not from enemy fire but from its own defensive systems going wrong in precisely the right sequence. Emergency protocols that were designed to protect the base instead made the damage worse, as each automated response created new vulnerabilities that the next human explosion could exploit. Zethkar recorded the entire process with growing amazement and horror. He had studied galactic warfare for decades and had never seen anything like what the humans were doing. They were not just fighting with primitive weapons. They were using the enemy's technological superiority against itself in ways that suggested a completely different understanding of how modern war should work. The base's main reactor began overloading as its cooling systems failed in exactly the sequence the humans had planned. Safety systems that had been tested for thousands of scenarios could not cope with the specific pattern of damage that Danny Clark's team had created. Zethkar watched in disbelief as one of the most advanced military installations in the galaxy began destroying itself because 12 humans with crude explosives had found flaws that Corvan engineers had never imagined. General Kexmore ordered immediate evacuation as his command center filled with toxic gases from damaged environmental systems. His perfectly coordinated soldiers stumbled through corridors that were becoming death traps as the base's own defenses turned against them. The shared consciousness that made Corvan so effective in normal warfare became a liability as panic and confusion spread through their neural links faster than their leaders could control. But the worst part for Zethkar was watching how the humans reacted to their success. Danny Clark and his team did not celebrate or show any emotion as they watched the Corvan base tear itself apart. They simply moved to their next target with the same calm efficiency they had shown throughout the operation, treating the destruction of an advanced military facility like it was routine work that required no special attention. Other human teams across the planet were conducting similar operations against smaller Corvan positions, and Zethkar began to see a pattern that made his blood run cold. The humans were not fighting random battles or responding to Corvan moves. They were executing a carefully planned campaign that treated every enemy installation like a puzzle to be solved, rather than a target to be destroyed through superior firepower. Each attack revealed new ways that human thinking differed from every other species Zethkar had studied. Where galactic warfare focused on overwhelming the enemy through technological superiority and coordinated mass attacks, the humans seemed to prefer finding unexpected weaknesses and exploiting them with minimal force applied in exactly the right way at precisely the right time. The psychological effect on the Corvans was devastating. Their military doctrine had prepared them for every kind of conventional attack, but offered no guidance for dealing with an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. Reports from surviving Corvan officers described an enemy that seemed to understand their technology better than they did, an enemy that could turn their greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses with tools that belonged in a museum. Zethkar began to understand that he was not documenting a war in any sense that the galaxy would recognize. He was watching something much more primitive and terrifying, something that suggested the humans had never stopped being the kind of predators that other species had evolved beyond millions of years ago. 3 weeks after the first human landing, Major Lisa Bennett established her command post in what had once been the Corvan Communications Center for the entire planet. Zethkar watched her walk through the captured facility like she owned it, speaking calmly into her communication device while Corvin prisoners worked under human supervision to repair equipment their own people had damaged during the evacuation. The sight disturbed Zethkar in ways he could not fully explain. Other species that captured enemy installations usually treated them as temporary positions to be held until the war ended, and proper negotiations could determine final ownership. But the humans had moved into Corvin facilities like they planned, to stay forever, modifying alien technology to serve human purposes and treating the sophisticated equipment like tools they had always owned. Lisa, Bennett's voice remained steady and professional as she coordinated human operations across the planet. But Zethkar noticed something in her tone that made his skin crawl. She discussed Corvin casualties and destroyed facilities with the same calm interest that other species might use when talking about weather or food supplies. The numbers she quoted represented hundreds of dead soldiers and millions of credits worth of destroyed equipment, but she might as well have been reading a shopping list. Zethkar enhanced his recordings to capture her conversations and found himself listening to tactical discussions that followed no pattern he recognized from galactic military training. Bennett and her officers talked about Corvin weaknesses like they were discussing flaws in machinery that needed to be repaired, analyzing enemy psychology and behavior, with the detached interest of scientists studying laboratory specimens. The humans had spent 3 weeks learning everything about Corvin technology, tactics, and thinking patterns, and they were using that knowledge to systematically dismantle an empire that had conquered dozens of worlds. But what frightened Zethkar was how easily they had acquired that understanding, as if reading alien minds and predicting enemy responses was something humans did naturally, rather than a skill that required years of training. He began reviewing all his recordings from the beginning, trying to understand when the war had actually ended, because it was becoming clear that the current situation was not really a battle anymore. The Corvins still had superior numbers and better individual equipment, but they were no longer fighting an enemy they could predict or counter. Instead, they were being systematically hunted by an opponent that seemed to understand them better than they understood themselves. The turning point had come during the second week when human teams stopped trying to destroy Corvin positions and instead began capturing them intact. Zethkar had initially thought this showed human inexperience with proper warfare, but now he realized it was part of a strategy that was far more sophisticated and terrifying than simple destruction. The humans were not just winning battles, they were learning from every engagement and becoming more dangerous with each victory. Every captured Corvin facility became a source of information that made the next attack more precise and devastating. Every prisoner provided data about Corvin, psychology and tactics that the humans used to predict and counter future enemy moves. The humans were not just fighting a war, they were conducting an educational program that used an entire enemy species as teaching material. General Kexmore's final communications before his capture revealed the complete breakdown of Corvin military effectiveness. His reports described an enemy that had somehow learned to think like Corvins while remaining fundamentally alien, an enemy that could predict Corvin responses to situations that had never happened before in galactic history. The general's last message begged his superiors to send negotiators rather than reinforcements, because military solutions no longer seemed possible. Zethkar realized that the humans had done something unprecedented in galactic warfare. They had turned their technological disadvantage into a weapon by forcing the enemy to fight in ways that superior technology could not address. Every Corvin advantage had been neutralized not through better equipment, but through better understanding of how to make those advantages irrelevant. The human fleet that had remained in space throughout the ground fighting finally moved toward the planet. But Zethkar could see they were not coming to support a difficult battle. They were arriving to collect the results of a campaign that had been decided weeks earlier by soldiers who had never fired the advanced weapons their ships carried. The space battle that everyone had expected was not going to happen, because there was no longer an enemy fleet capable of fighting it. Captain Jake Morrison's ships moved into orbit around Kepler 442b, like they were taking possession of property they had purchased rather than conquered. The remaining Corvin vessels fled without attempting to engage, their crews too demoralized and confused to mount any kind of organized resistance. Zethkar watched the most advanced military force in that sector of the galaxy retreat from an enemy they still did not understand. But what haunted Zethkar most was watching Lisa Bennett coordinate the aftermath of victory with the same calm professionalism she had shown during the fighting. She discussed prisoner treatment, equipment salvage, and planetary occupation like she had done this many times before, even though this was supposed to be humanity's first real space war. Her certainty and competence suggested that humans had been preparing for galactic warfare much longer than anyone realized. The more Zethkar studied the recordings, the more he understood that he had not witnessed a normal military campaign. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond what any species should have been able to develop in their first encounter with advanced galactic warfare. They had shown an understanding of psychology, technology, and strategy that suggested they had been studying their potential enemies for years before revealing themselves to the galactic community. He began to suspect that humanity's apparent primitiveness when they first joined the galaxy had been carefully calculated to make other species underestimate their capabilities. The crude technology and simple diplomatic approaches that had marked their early interactions now seemed like camouflage designed to hide something much more sophisticated and dangerous. Zethkar found himself staring at his instruments and wondering, what kind of species could master galactic warfare so quickly and completely, while making it look easy and routine? The humans had not just defeated the Corvins, they had done it in a way that demonstrated total understanding of their enemy while revealing almost nothing about their own true capabilities. It was the kind of strategic thinking that older galactic species had taken centuries to develop, accomplished by newcomers in their first real test. Zethkar sat in his private quarters aboard the Observer's Eye and stared at the data pad containing his complete recordings of the human-Corvin conflict. 6 weeks of detailed documentation that told a story the Galactic Council was not prepared to hear. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed footage of Lisa Bennett, calmly discussing the psychological warfare techniques her teams had used to break down Corvin morale, speaking about enemy mental conditioning like she was describing the weather. The journey back to Council space took 12 days, and Zethkar spent most of that time trying to figure out how to explain what he had witnessed. Every previous report he had written followed the same basic pattern because every first war ended the same way, with new species learning hard lessons about the realities of galactic conflict. But this time the only species that had learned anything was humanity, and what they had learned was how to completely dominate an advanced military empire using tactics that violated every assumption about civilized warfare. He had recorded everything according to his instructions, but now, he found himself unable to watch certain sections without feeling physically ill. The footage of human soldiers arranging Corvin bodies in specific patterns to send psychological messages to the next patrol. The communications intercepts showing how humans had systematically destroyed enemy morale by demonstrating that no Corvin position was safe and no Corvin tactic was effective. The interviews with Corvin prisoners who described their captors as polite and professional, while conducting interrogations that revealed every detail of enemy operations and psychology. The worst recordings were the ones that showed human reactions to their own success. Where other species would have celebrated victory or shown emotion at defeating a superior enemy, the humans had displayed the calm satisfaction of workers completing a routine job. They had dismantled an entire military empire, with less emotional involvement than most species showed when organizing supply deliveries. When the Observer's Eye reached Council Station, Zethkar was greeted by the usual ceremony that marked the return of a successful monitoring mission. Council members gathered to hear his preliminary report and receive the data that would help them understand how the newest galactic species had performed in their first real test. Everyone expected to learn that humanity had either been defeated and educated or had achieved a costly victory that taught them respect for galactic military standards. Instead, Zethkar found himself standing before the assembled council with recordings that showed humanity had not just won, but had done so in ways that suggested they were more dangerous than any species currently in the galactic community. He looked at the expectant faces around him and realized that telling the truth would create panic and fear that could destabilize centuries of peaceful cooperation between species. The official report he presented described human tactics as unconventional, but effective, emphasizing their creativity and adaptability while downplaying the psychological warfare and systematic manipulation that had actually won the conflict. He mentioned their primitive weapons and simple technology, while avoiding any discussion of how those limitations had been turned into advantages through superior strategic thinking. The council received his sanitized report with satisfaction and mild surprise, noting that humans had performed better than expected but still within normal parameters for a new spacefaring species. They discussed welcoming humanity more fully into galactic affairs and offering them opportunities to learn proper military procedures from more experienced civilizations. Sethkar said nothing while listening to plans that assumed humans needed guidance from species they had already proven they could outthink and outfight. But in his private files, Sethkar kept the real recordings and the complete analysis that revealed what humanity actually represented. Hours of documentation showing that humans had not stumbled into victory through luck or primitive enthusiasm, but had executed a carefully planned campaign that demonstrated mastery of psychological warfare, technological adaptation, and strategic thinking that surpassed anything in galactic military history. The humans had not just defeated the Corvins, they had done it while learning everything about galactic warfare standards and revealing almost nothing about their own true capabilities. Every engagement had been a test designed to gather information about how galactic species fought and thought, while demonstrating just enough human ability to achieve victory without showing the full extent of their dangerous competence. In the II, weeks following his return, Sethkar watched with growing unease as other council members celebrated humanity's integration into galactic society. Trade agreements were signed, diplomatic exchanges were arranged, and human representatives were invited to participate in discussions about regional security and military cooperation. Everyone seemed eager to share knowledge and technology with these promising newcomers who had shown such impressive adaptability in their first conflict. But Sethkar remembered Lisa Bennett's calm voice, discussing casualty reports, and Jake Morrison's efficient occupation of conquered territory, and he began making quiet preparations for a future that other council members could not imagine. He upgraded his ship's defensive systems and researched remote territories beyond the current borders of galactic civilization, places where an experienced observer might find refuge when the galaxy finally understood what it had welcomed into its midst, because Sethkar had learned something that would take the rest of the galaxy much longer to realize. Humanity had not joined the galactic community to learn from older and wiser species. They had joined to study potential enemies and prepare for conflicts that other species did not even know were coming. Their apparent primitiveness and enthusiasm for learning had been carefully crafted camouflage designed to hide the fact that they were already more dangerous than anyone else in known space. The nightmare Sethkar had witnessed was not humanity's capacity for violence, which was impressive but not unique among galactic species. The real horror was their ability to make that violence seem reasonable and necessary while systematically gathering intelligence about every potential threat in the galaxy. They had turned first contact into reconnaissance, and their integration into galactic society into the greatest intelligence-gathering operation in recorded history. And now they were inside the system, trusted and welcomed by species who had no idea they had just invited the most effective predators in the galaxy to study them up close. Sethkar packed his personal belongings and filed a request for extended exploration duty in the Outer Rim territories, hoping to be very far away when humanity finally decided that the learning phase was over and the real war could begin.